What happens when royal privilege collides with hard-hitting journalism on live television? In just 41 seconds, a single question would transform a routine morning interview into the most explosive television moment of the year, ending with security escorting a member of the British royal family offset in front of millions of shocked viewers. The Good Morning America studio buzzed with its usual early morning energy. George Stephanopoulos sat confidently behind the curved desk, his notes perfectly arranged, while co-hosts Robin Roberts and Michael Strahan flanked him on either side. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the heat from the studio lights as camera operators made their final adjustments. "We're back in 30 seconds, called out the floor director, his voice cutting through the morning chatter. George straightened his tie and glanced at his talking points one more time. This was supposed to be a straightforward promotional interview. Prince Harry was making the rounds to discuss his latest charitable initiative, and Good Morning America had scored the exclusive. Standard questions about his foundation work, maybe a softball about his life in California, and they'd wrap up with plenty of time before the commercial break. And we're live in 5, 4, 3. The director counted down silently with his fingers. The red light blinked on as the familiar Good Morning America theme music faded out. "Welcome back to Good Morning America," George began with his trademark warm smile. "I'm here with my co-hosts Robin Roberts and Michael Strahan, and we're joined now by Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. Your Royal Highness, thank you for being with us this morning." Prince Harry sat across from the panel, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if he owned not just the chair he was sitting in, but the entire studio. "Please, just Harry is fine," he said with that practiced royal charm, flashing the smile that had melted hearts around the world for decades. Robin Roberts leaned forward slightly, her voice warm and welcoming. "Harry, we're so excited to have you here. You've been working tirelessly on your Archewell Foundation, and the impact you're making is really extraordinary." Harry's eyes lit up as he launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed talking point. "Thank you, Robin. You know, when Meghan and I started Archewell, we wanted to create something that could really make a difference. We're not just throwing money at problems. We're getting our hands dirty, working with communities, understanding what they actually need." Michael Strahan nodded approvingly. "That hands-on approach seems to be your style. Can you tell us about some of the specific programs you're most proud of?" "Absolutely, Michael. One of our flagship initiatives is focused on mental health awareness in underserved communities. We've partnered with local organizations across the country to provide resources and support where it's needed most. It's not about us swooping in and telling people what they need. It's about listening, learning, and then amplifying the work that's already being done." George watched this exchange with the patience of a seasoned interviewer. He knew how these things worked. Let the guests get comfortable, let them hit their talking points, build that rapport. The real questions would come later. "That's wonderful," Robin said, her genuine enthusiasm evident. "And I understand you have some personal experience that drives this passion for mental health advocacy." Harry's expression grew more serious, but still controlled. "I do, Robin. I've been very open about my own struggles with mental health, particularly after losing my mother. For too long, there was this stigma around talking about these issues, especially in my family, especially in my position. But I learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's actually strength." The studio audience, small as it was, murmured appreciatively. This was the Harry they'd come to expect. Thoughtful, candid, relatable, despite his extraordinary circumstances. Michael seized on this opening. "Speaking of your family, how has your relationship with them evolved since you and Meghan stepped back from your royal duties?" For just a moment, something flickered across Harry's face. A tightness around the eyes, a subtle shift in his posture. But his media training kicked in immediately. "Look, Michael, family relationships are complicated for everyone, whether you're royal or not. We're all just trying to do what's best for our children, what's best for our futures. There have been challenges, certainly, but I remain hopeful that time and understanding will heal any wounds that exist." George made a note on his pad. That was politician speak, if he'd ever heard it. Lots of words that said absolutely nothing. But this was still warm-up territory. He glanced at his watch. They were about halfway through the segment, and so far everything was proceeding exactly as Harry's handlers had undoubtedly planned. Robin picked up the thread. "You mentioned your children, and I know our viewers would love to hear about how you and Meghan are raising Archie and Lilibet here in America. How are they adjusting?" Harry's entire demeanor brightened instantly. "They're incredible, Robin, truly. Archie is this curious, energetic little boy who asks questions about everything. And Lilibet, she's got this wonderful spirit. this joy that just fills up whatever room she's in. We're trying to give them as normal a childhood as possible while also helping them understand their unique heritage. That must be challenging, Michael observed, balancing their royal heritage with your desire for privacy and normalcy. It is, Harry acknowledged. But Meghan and I are committed to protecting them from the toxic environment that I grew up in. We want them to know about their grandfather, their uncle, their cousins, but we also want them to make their own choices about how involved they want to be with that world. There it was again, that subtle edge when he talked about his family. George caught it, filed it away. His years covering politics had taught him to recognize when someone was holding something back, when the carefully constructed facade was hiding something more volatile underneath. The floor director held up a card, indicating they had about 3 minutes left in the segment. Time for George to earn his paycheck. Harry, George said, his voice still friendly but carrying a new weight. I want to ask you about something that I think a lot of our viewers are curious about. Harry turned toward him, eyebrows raised expectantly. Of course, your foundation does incredible work, and your advocacy for mental health and social justice is admirable. But I have to ask, given your family's history and the institution you were born into, how do you reconcile promoting equality and social justice while also benefiting from a system that is fundamentally built on hereditary privilege and wealth inequality? The change in Harry was immediate and unmistakable. His jaw tightened, his shoulders tensed, and his eyes narrowed as they fixed on George. The practiced smile vanished, replaced by something colder, more calculating. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 seconds. Harry's media training was screaming at him to deflect, to pivot, to give some polished non-answer that would keep the interview on track. But something about George's question, the way it cut right to the heart of everything Harry had been trying to avoid, triggered something deeper. I think that's a rather loaded question, George, Harry said, his voice noticeably cooler now. You're making assumptions about my motivations and my work based on circumstances I was born into, not choices I made. George didn't flinch. If anything, he leaned forward slightly, sensing he'd struck a nerve. But isn't that exactly the point? You were born into extraordinary privilege. You've benefited from that privilege your entire life. Now you're positioning yourself as a champion of equality while still using your royal title and status to open doors and raise money. Some might call that hypocritical. Robin and Michael exchanged quick glances. This wasn't going according to script. Robin tried to smooth things over with her trademark diplomatic touch. I think what George is getting at, Harry, is how you navigate that balance between using your platform for good while acknowledging the system that created that platform in the first place. But Harry wasn't looking at Robin. His focus was laser focused on George, and his composure was slipping fast. Hypocritical? Harry repeated, his voice rising slightly. George, with respect, I think you need to check your facts before making accusations like that on national television. What facts am I getting wrong? George asked calmly. You hold a hereditary title. You benefit from wealth that was accumulated through centuries of colonialism and exploitation. Yet you lecture others about inequality. Help me understand how that's not contradictory. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Camera operators kept filming, but several crew members had stopped what they were doing to watch the exchange. This was no longer an interview. This was becoming a confrontation. Harry's face was flushing red now, his carefully maintained royal composure cracking like ice on a frozen pond. You know what, George? I came here to talk about important work that's actually making a difference in people's lives. But instead, you want to play gotcha journalism and attack me personally. I'm not attacking you personally, George replied evenly. I'm asking legitimate questions about public policy and social responsibility, questions that I think our viewers deserve answers to. Your viewers? Harry laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your viewers don't care about these philosophical debates, George. They care about solutions. They care about results. And that's exactly what my foundation is delivering. Michael tried to jump in, his voice diplomatic but firm. Harry, I think what we're all interested in is how you've evolved since stepping back from royal duties. How has that experience changed your perspective on these issues? But Harry barely acknowledged him. He was locked in battle with George now, and his famous temper, the one that tabloids had written about for years, was finally making its television debut. You want to know what's hypocritical, George? Harry said, pointing a finger across the desk. What's hypocritical is sitting in your ivory tower, making millions of dollars a year reading teleprompters, while questioning the motives of people who are actually out there doing the work. The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze. George's expression remained neutral, but there was a new intensity in his eyes. Harry, I've spent decades covering stories around the world, from war zones to disaster areas to political upheaval. I've seen poverty, injustice, and inequality up close. So, when someone with your background tells me they're fighting inequality, I think it's fair to ask how. How dare you? Harry shot back, his voice now loud enough that people in the hallway outside could probably hear it. How dare you question my commitment to these causes? You have no idea what I've sacrificed, what I've given up to do this work. Robin tried again, her voice gentle but increasingly urgent. Harry, maybe we can step back for a moment and— No, Robin, Harry interrupted, his eyes still locked on George. I want to hear George explain to your viewers how asking gotcha questions helps anyone. How does ambushing guests help solve mental health crises? How does playing politics help feed hungry children? George's voice remained steady, professional, but there was steel underneath it now. Harry, nobody ambushed you. These are questions that have been raised in numerous publications by respected journalists and commentators. I'm simply giving you an opportunity to address them directly. Respected journalists? Harry scoffed. You mean the same media that hounded my mother to her death? The same press that drove my wife out of this country with their racism and lies? That's your definition of respected journalism? Now George's expression shifted. The comparison to his mother's death, the accusation about media responsibility, had clearly touched a nerve. Harry, I understand you have complicated feelings about the press, and rightfully so given your family's history. But conflating legitimate policy questions with tabloid harassment is unfair, and frankly, it's beneath you. Beneath me? Harry stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the studio floor. You want to lecture me about what's beneath me? You, who's never had to worry about your children's safety because of media attention? You, who's never had photographers camping outside your home, following your every move? The floor director was frantically signaling to the control room. This was spiraling out of control fast, and they were still live on national television. George remained seated, his voice calm but firm. Harry, I think you're missing the point of my original question. I'm not questioning your personal struggles or your family's tragic history with the media. I'm asking how you reconcile your advocacy work with your position in a hereditary system of privilege. And I'm telling you that your question is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what I'm actually doing, Harry fired back. But you're not interested in understanding, are you, George? You're interested in creating conflict, in manufacturing drama for ratings? Michael stood up now too, his height and presence commanding attention. Okay, I think we all need to take a breath here. This is clearly a sensitive topic, and maybe we can find a way to discuss it more constructively. But Harry whirled on him, his composure completely gone now. Constructively? Michael, there's nothing constructive about what's happening here. This is character assassination disguised as journalism. George finally stood as well, his patience clearly wearing thin. Harry, if you can't handle basic questions about your public positions, then maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews on national television. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Harry's face went from red to white in an instant, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. You know what, George? Harry's voice was shaking with rage now, all pretense of royal dignity abandoned. You think you're so clever with your little questions, don't you? You think you've caught me in some kind of trap? George remained standing but kept his voice level, though the tension in his jaw was visible. Harry, this is a simple interview. If you can't answer basic questions about your public advocacy, that says more about your positions than it does about my questions. Basic questions? Harry laughed bitterly. These aren't basic questions, George. This is a hit job. This is exactly the kind of toxic journalism that destroyed my family. Robin stood up now, her voice urgent, but still trying to maintain some semblance of control. Gentlemen, we're live on television. Maybe we should take a commercial break and discuss this off air. No, Harry snapped, not even looking at her. I want everyone to see this. I want your viewers to see exactly what kind of person George Stephanopoulos really island. Someone who pretends to care about important issues, but really just wants to tear people down. The floor director was waving frantically at the control room, but the producers had made their decision. This was television gold, and they were staying live. George's professional mask was finally starting to slip. Harry, you came on this show to promote your foundation. I asked you a legitimate question about how you reconcile your advocacy with your privileged position. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, then maybe you're not ready for the public spotlight. Not ready for the spotlight? Harry's voice cracked slightly, his emotions overwhelming his ability to speak clearly. I was born into the spotlight, George. I've lived my entire life under microscopes and cameras and people like you deciding what I can and cannot say. Then you should understand better than anyone how this works. George shot back, his own patience finally exhausted. Public figures get asked tough questions. That's part of the job. You can't demand a platform and then complain when people expect you to defend your positions. Harry took a step closer to the desk, his fists still clenched. Defend my positions? I don't have to defend anything to you, George. Especially not to someone who's built his career on attacking people who can't fight back. Michael moved slightly, positioning himself between Harry and George. His voice was firm now, no longer diplomatic. Harry, you need to calm down right now. This behavior is completely unacceptable. But Harry spun toward Michael, his face twisted with fury. Unacceptable? You want to know what's unacceptable? What's unacceptable is inviting someone onto your show under false pretenses and then ambushing them with gotcha questions. Nobody ambushed you, George said firmly. These questions were entirely predictable given your public statements and your position. Any competent media team would have prepared you for them. My media team? Harry's voice was getting higher, more erratic. My media team told me this would be a friendly interview about my foundation work. They said you were professionals. They obviously don't know you very well, do they, George? The camera operators kept rolling, capturing every moment of Harry's meltdown in high definition. This was the kind of footage that would be replayed for years to come. Robin tried one more time to salvage the situation. Harry, why don't we sit down and try to have a constructive conversation about your important work? That's what everyone wants to hear about. Constructive? Harry whirled on her now, his rage indiscriminate. Robin, there's nothing constructive about what's happening here. Your colleague has turned this into a circus, and you're all just sitting there letting it happen. That's enough, George said, his voice cutting through Harry's tirade. Harry, you're embarrassing yourself and disrespecting my colleagues. Either sit down and conduct yourself appropriately, or this interview is over. The studio fell silent for a moment. Harry stared at George, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his whole body trembling with anger. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was cold, calculating, dangerous. You want to end this interview, George? Fine. But first, let me tell your viewers exactly what kind of man you are. Let me tell them about the journalists who think they're untouchable, who think they can destroy people's lives for entertainment. Harry, stop, Michael said sharply. You're way out of line here. But Harry ignored him completely. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes blazing with fury. America, you're watching a perfect example of why I left England. This is the toxic media culture that killed my mother and drove my wife away from everything she knew. George had heard enough. That's completely inappropriate, and you know it. You're using your family's tragedy to deflect from legitimate questions about your public positions. That's not just wrong, it's cowardly. The word cowardly hit Harry like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, then white again. For a moment, it looked like he might actually lunge across the desk at George. Cowardly? He whispered, his voice deadly quiet. You just called me cowardly on national television? The floor director was frantically signaling to security now. This had crossed every line, and they needed professional intervention. I called your behavior cowardly, George clarified, but his stance had shifted slightly, ready for whatever might come next. Using your mother's death to avoid answering policy questions is cowardly, yes. Harry exploded. How dare you? He screamed, loud enough that his voice echoed off the studio walls. How dare you use her name? You have no right to talk about my mother. He took another step toward the desk, and that's when security finally moved. Two large men in suits appeared from the wings, moving quickly but calmly toward the increasingly erratic prince. Sir, we need you to step back, one of them said firmly. Harry spun toward them, his eyes wild. Don't you touch me. Do you know who I am? Yes, sir. We know exactly who you are, the security guard replied evenly. That's why we're asking you to leave voluntarily before this gets any worse. Leave? Harry looked around the studio wildly, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. You're throwing me out? You're actually throwing me out? George sat back down, his voice calm but final. Harry, you've made it clear you can't have a civil conversation. This interview is over. This interview was over the moment you decided to attack me instead of letting me talk about my work, Harry snarled. But the fight was going out of him now, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. The security guards moved closer, not threatening, but making their presence unmistakably clear. I don't need your security guards, Harry said, trying to regain some dignity. I'll leave on my own. But as he turned to go, he couldn't resist one final shot. This is exactly why people don't trust the media anymore, George. This is why your ratings are tanking and nobody believes anything you say. George didn't take the bait. I'm sorry it came to this, Harry. I hope you find a way to have more productive conversations about these important issues in the future. Harry stared at him for a long moment, his mouth opening and closing, as if he wanted to say something else. But the security guards were right there, and the cameras were still rolling, and suddenly he seemed to realize how completely he had destroyed himself on live television. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, the security guards flanking him at a respectful distance. His shoulders were rigid with barely controlled rage, his hands still clenched into fists. As the studio doors closed behind him with a soft thud, George turned back to the camera, his professional composure completely restored. "We'll be right back after this commercial break," he said calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened at all.